In that quiet little house on the edge of town, where autumn leaves piled like forgotten memories along the front steps, lived a family once full of joy, now divided by something deeper than words. The father, Mr. Hargrave, was once a schoolteacher, stern but fair. He loved books more than bread, and believed that respect was the cornerstone of any home. But over the years his back had bent with age, and his heart more with disappointment than time. The mother, Eleanor, wore her years in silence. She had soft hands that once stitched their children's clothes, baked their birthdays, and bandaged their scraped knees. But somewhere along the way, her gaze turned colder, not cruel, but too selective. She smiled more at one son than the other. 2 sons, 2 hearts, 2 paths. The elder, Caleb, sharp, tall, and always dressed as though the world owed him attention. 35 now, he had studied abroad, returned with a loud laugh and louder opinions, and quickly married the daughter of a powerful businessman. Wedding was a grand affair, golden ribbons, chandeliers, 1,000 faces neither side had ever met. The parents stood proud that day, smiling like they'd won a prize. They praised his every move, boasted of his wealth, his car, his wife's connections. Our Caleb, they would say, is going places. Then there was Elijah 20-7, thoughtful, quieter than his brother, and always the first to offer help, whether it was cleaning the gutters, fetching groceries, or simply sitting by his mother when she had headaches. He too held degrees, knowledge, and dreams, but they paid less. He worked with numbers, with care, in a small firm where he was respected but not rich. When Elijah fell in love with Mira, a school librarian with a soft smile and sunlit voice, there was no grand celebration, no chandeliers, just a modest gathering in a community hall. Mira wore a simple dress, her hair pinned with jasmine. Caleb did not attend, the parents did. But they barely spoke. The gifts they brought were secondhand. And when Mira served them tea with trembling hands, Eleanor simply nodded without a word. From that day on, the air shifted. The parents often forgot Elijah's birthday, but always remembered Caleb's. They praised Caleb's wife's sense of class and manners, though she rarely visited. But when Myra brought home-cooked meals and left flowers in the hallway, they'd say, "You try too hard." Still, Elijah remained kind, and so did Mira. They took the small room upstairs, paid rent without delay, never raised their voices, until one evening, the candlelight flickered again as the rain deepened. That night, Caleb had returned after months away. Sleek, foreign machines sat parked boldly in the family driveway. He strolled in with the arrogance of someone who knew the floor wouldn't creak beneath him. With him was Layla, his wife. She walked as if the house belonged to her. "I've missed this old place," Caleb said, setting his shoes on the antique rug Elijah had bought from a roadside vendor. "It misses you too," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly warm. "Come, I made your favorite stew." Elijah stood in the hallway, Mira beside him, holding a tray of freshly baked bread. Layla glanced at them, then turned away, and no one noticed. That night after dinner, while Elijah was washing dishes and Mira folded laundry, Caleb sat with his parents in the living room. The laughter was loud, the talk full of pride and plans that did not include the old house. "I think you should sell it," Caleb said casually, swirling his glass. "It's old, falling apart. You both could move into our guest house Layla and I have. Space." Mr. Hargrave furrowed his brow. "Sell. But this house, it's worth a fortune now," Caleb said. "The market's ripe. I've already had a chat with a buyer. You'd be amazed how much he's offering." Elijah heard this from the kitchen. He froze. The sponge in his hand slipped into the water. The next morning, a cold letter arrived. At the house's doorstep, a notice, official, clean, and cruel. The deed had already changed hands, and Elijah was the one blamed. Layla, with tears that came too quickly, claimed she had overheard Elijah talking to a stranger about selling the house. "He wanted the money," she whispered to Eleanor. "He's jealous of Caleb." Eleanor believed her. Mr. Hargrave did not fully. But he said nothing. Silence, too, is a betrayal. That evening, as the wind picked up and dry leaves scurried like frightened children outside, Elijah and Mira were asked to leave, not with cruelty, but with that quiet, indifferent coldness that hurts deeper than rage. "Point staying," Eleanor had said. "There's tension. You'll be better off." Elsewhere, Mira's eyes filled with tears. Elijah simply nodded. He packed slowly, quietly, folding each shirt with care, as if this final act of dignity might save him from breaking. They left that night. No candle was lit for their farewell. The road was empty that night. Street lamps flickered like tired eyes. The umbrella Elijah held trembled in the breeze, not from wind alone, but from the weight of what had just happened. Mira clung gently to his arm.
Not of fear, but solidarity.
Her silence wasn't the silence of anger, but of mourning. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak of injustice. She only walked beside him, step for step, heartbeat for heartbeat. They didn't own much. A few bags, a box of books, a kettle, a worn blanket from Mira's childhood, and still, even those felt like too much to carry that night. After walking a few blocks, Elijah finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice almost swallowed by the rain. "You married into this, and they treated you?" "I married you," Mira said gently, interrupting, "not them." And just like that, the sorrow shifted slightly. It's no longer sharp but soft, something to carry, not something to collapse. Beneath, they stayed that first week at Mira's cousin's home, a small apartment near the river. It had just 2 rooms and a squeaky fan, but the windows looked out onto a quiet garden. And at night, you could hear the soft hush of river, water against the stones. In the quiet of that space, Elijah sat each evening and stared out the window. Not in anger, but in confusion. He had always done the right things. He'd respected, loved, obeyed, given, and yet it hadn't been enough. Mira, noticing his stillness one night, brought over 2 cups of warm milk, one with a sprinkle of cinnamon. "Just how he liked it. You've done nothing wrong," she said softly. "But maybe that's the problem," Elijah replied, eyes fixed on the stars. "Sometimes being good doesn't protect you." Mira sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe not, but it grounds you, and in the end, that's what builds a life." He looked at her, and for the first time in days, he smiled. A small, tired, but true smile in the weeks that followed. Elijah threw himself into his work. He worked extra hours, picking up side projects late into the night. Mira also took on more shifts at the library, sometimes cataloging books, until her eyes blurred. Together they saved. They didn't complain. They didn't rush. And slowly, a new life began to bloom. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. They rented a small home, just 2 rooms again, but this one had a tiny garden. In front, Mira planted sunflowers. Elijah painted the door a gentle blue. On weekends, they invited neighbors over for tea. And the laughter they shared in that tiny home echoed louder than any luxury ever could. Months passed, then a year, and then something beautiful. Elijah received a promotion, not expected, not flashy, but meaningful. His honesty, calm nature, and steady work had caught the eye of someone higher up. He was now managing a small team. That same week, Mira discovered that a children's reading program she'd quietly built at the library was being funded by the city. They celebrated with hot chocolate and a walk under the moon. It was simple, but everything they had once dreamed of was now beginning to come true. Still, on certain nights, as the wind rustled, the curtains and the clock ticked on, Elijah would glance toward the direction of his old home, not in longing, but in quiet reflection. He hadn't heard much from his parents, only a few short, distant messages from Mr. Hargrave. No warmth, no apology, but also no anger, just silence. Until one Sunday afternoon, Mira was pruning the sunflowers. Elijah was inside reading. A knock came at the door, soft, reluctant. He opened it, found his father, older, weaker, and alone. Mr. Hargrave looked up at his younger son, And for a moment, the years melted away. Elijah wasn't a man anymore, but a boy, standing at the threshold of love, waiting to be seen. "Can I come in?" the old man asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded, stepping aside. They sat at the small wooden table. Mira brought tea and quietly excused herself to the garden. For a long time, neither father nor son spoke. Finally, Mr. Hargrave sighed. "I didn't know," he began. "Not fully. About Caleb, about Layla. I believed what I wanted to believe, and I didn't see what was real." Elijah listened, still silent. "They sold the house, not long after you left. I thought we'd move into their home. But after a month, Layla, she made it clear we were not welcome." He paused. The teacup in his hands trembled slightly. "She said we were a burden, that she never agreed to care for old people. And Caleb, it didn't stop her." A cold wind brushed through the window. "They sent us to a small apartment. We barely spoke. He stopped answering my calls." Mr. Hargrave looked up, his eyes glistening. "I didn't know where else to go. And last week the doctor told me. It's my heart." Placed a small envelope on the table. "Hospital reports. I don't know how much time I have. But what I do know is I was wrong." Elijah's throat tightened. Not because he was angry, but because, despite it all, this was still his father. "I never wanted your money," Elijah said gently. "I just wanted you to see me. To see us." "I know," the old man whispered. "And if you'll let me, I'd like to see you now, truly." Elijah looked toward the window where Mira was kneeling beside the sunflowers, her hands deep in the soil. Her heart still open despite everything. He looked back at his father and softly. Slowly, he nodded. "You can stay here," Elijah said. "But not as a burden, as family." That night, Mira prepared the guest room with fresh sheets. She lit a lavender candle, set a glass of water by the bedside. Quietly, gently, they welcomed Mr. Hargrave into their home, and for the first time in years, the air felt full again, full of hope. Mr. Hargrave, once so proud and stern, now spent most mornings by the garden window, wrapped in a light blanket, sipping warm tea, watching Myra's sunflowers sway in the breeze. Sometimes he would whisper a prayer under his breath. Other times he would simply sit, letting silence say what his words never could. Elijah didn't press for apologies, didn't ask for explanations. He simply let time mend what time had broken gently, steadily, like hands sewing an old torn quilt. Mira treated Mr. Hargrave with quiet respect. She never reminded him of the past, never showed the hurt he had once caused. She brought him his medicines on time, made him soups he didn't ask for, and read to him when his eyes got too tired to follow the print. One evening, as twilight wrapped the house in soft lavender light, Mr. Hargrave asked to sit outside. Elijah brought him a chair. Mira draped a shawl over his shoulders, and for a while they sat together in silence. The breeze carried the scent of earth and warm tea. Far off, a child's laughter echoed. And in that stillness, Mr. Hargrave finally spoke. "I see now what I failed to see then." Elijah didn't answer. He knew what was coming. "I thought success was measured by money, titles, influence. I thought your brother was winning at life because he had more." He paused, his voice trembling. "But you've built something real, something honest and peaceful. You've given me more love in these few weeks than I gave you in all those years." Elijah looked at his father. His eyes didn't hold bitterness, only quiet acceptance. "I used to wonder what I was missing," Elijah said softly. "Why I wasn't enough. But now I realize I was always enough. You just weren't ready to see it." Mr. Hargrave lowered his head. "I see it now. Something unexpected. Tears, not loud or dramatic. Just quiet drops sliding down weathered cheeks. It's a lifetime of pride." Melting at last, Mira gently took his hand. "It's never too late," she whispered. That night, Elijah tucked his father into bed. Not as a duty, but as a son, as someone who still believed in healing, even after everything. A month passed. Then, too, Mr. Hargrave's health improved slightly, enough to walk around the garden with a cane, enough to laugh a little, to read a book now and then. to ask Mira about her childhood. To ask Elijah about his work, he began writing letters to Eleanor, still living with Caleb, though no longer happily. She hadn't visited once since he moved in with Elijah. But she answered the letters, short and polite. Her pride still stood tall, even as the world around her began to crumble. One morning, as autumn returned, bringing golden leaves and cooler winds, a neighbor knocked on the door. He held a newspaper. Elijah opened the gate and took it. The man's worried expression. "I thought you should see this," the neighbor said. On the front page, businessman and son arrested for fraud, land theft, and money laundering. Photos, details, charges there in the center of it all was Caleb. Elijah's breath caught. He took the paper inside, sat at the kitchen table, read every word. Slowly, it was worse than he imagined. Caleb had been involved in several illegal deals, shell companies, forged documents, bribes. And the house? Their childhood home? It had been sold through a fraudulent signature, forged in Mr. Hargrave's name. Layla had signed as a witness. It was all. It's deliberate, calculated betrayal in its purest form. Mr. Hargrave read the article. With shaking hands, when he reached the end, he didn't speak. He simply sat back and closed his eyes. "I raised a stranger," he whispered. "I pushed away the only one who stayed true." But Elijah didn't let his father sit in that pain for long. He folded the paper, placed it aside, and poured 2 cups of warm milk. "Whatever. He's done. We won't let it define us," he said gently. Mr. Hargrave nodded. "But what now?" "He's my son." Elijah looked out the window. The sunflowers were taller now, their golden heads heavy with life. Myra was out there again. Trimming the dried leaves, he made his choices, Elijah said. "And now, we'll make ours." That evening, Elijah called the lawyer listed in the article, quietly, privately. He offered help not to free Caleb from justice, but to ensure he had a fair trial. To ensure the truth came out. It wasn't about revenge. It was about doing the right thing, even for the one who had done so much wrong. A few weeks later, the trial began. Caleb's name was all over the news. Layla tried to shift the blame, as always, but the evidence was clear, and this time, no one believed her. Tears he was sentenced, not harshly, but enough to finally stop running from the consequences of his actions. On the day Caleb was moved to the city prison, Mr. Hargrave asked Elijah something unexpected. "Will you come with me to see him?" Elijah hesitated, just once. His father said, "I need to look at him. One last time." Elijah agreed. At the detention center, they sat behind a glass wall. Caleb looked different, tired, thinner, but still holding on to the same arrogance. Though now dimmed, Mr. Hargrave picked up the phone. Caleb smirked. "Didn't expect you. I raised you," Mr. Hargrave said quietly, "but I never truly knew you." Caleb rolled his eyes. "Save it." "I'm not here to argue," the old man continued. "I'm here to tell you that I forgive you, but you will not be part of our lives again." Caleb stared. For a moment, the mask dropped. "Forgive me?" Mr. Hargrave nodded. "You are my son. That won't change. But some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt." He gently placed the phone down, stood up and walked away. Elijah followed, silently. In the car ride home, they didn't speak, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, as though something had finally been put to rest. That night, as Mira lit a candle by the window, Mr. Hargrave sat beside her. "Thank you," he said softly. She smiled. "For what?" "For seeing the best in us, even when we couldn't." The candle flickered gently. Outside, a soft rain began to fall. Not heavy, just enough to soothe. Elijah stood in the doorway, watching his wife and his father wrapped in the quiet of healing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. The following morning began like any other, slowly, sweetly, with golden morning light slipping between the curtains like a blessing. Birds chirped gently in the trees outside. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's wind chime whispered in the breeze. And from the kitchen, comforting sound of the kettle's soft whistle filled the quiet house. Mira stood barefoot on the tiled floor, wrapping her hands around a warm mug. She gazed out at the garden, where the last of the autumn flowers swayed, petals beginning to curl with the changing season. Elijah joined her, still drowsy from sleep. His hair tousled, his voice low and soft. "Smells like cinnamon." "It is," she smiled. "Thought we'd start today with something gentle." He leaned down to kiss her cheek, then turned his gaze out the window. Mr. Hargrave was already in the garden, walking slowly between the flower beds. His cane tapped rhythmically against the stones, but his movements were steadier now, less fragile, more present. The garden had become his sanctuary. Sometimes he would sit for hours under the oak tree, eyes closed, listening, not to music, not to conversation, just to the wind and the silence. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft oranges and blush pinks, he called Elijah and Mira to the garden bench. "I want to say something," he began, voice quieter. "Now, not from weakness, but from care. I spent most of my life believing that love had to be earned, that it came with achievement, money, status. I taught that to you and Caleb without knowing the cost." He turned to Elijah. "I realize now, the most precious things in life are often the ones we overlook. Quiet gestures, the meals made with love, the people who stay, even when they're mistreated." Mira reached for his hand, resting it between her own. "You didn't fail," she said gently. "You just forgot to see." Mr. Hargrave nodded. "I want to make it right, as much as I can." He paused, then handed Elijah a small envelope. Inside was a folded letter. "A will. I had it changed," he said. "Everything I have, what's left, will go to you. The savings, the investments, you and Mira. You've earned it, not with wealth, but with love." Elijah shook his head. "I don't need anything, Dad, really." "I know," Mr. Hargrave replied, his eyes warm. "That's why you deserve it." There was no pride in his voice now, only peace. Winter arrived gently that year. The first snow was soft and light, dusting the rooftops and frosting the garden like powdered sugar. Mira placed candles in the windows. Elijah installed a tiny fireplace, not grand, but cozy, and each evening the three of them would gather around it, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea and telling small stories from their day. Sometimes they would listen to music from a little radio. Old songs. Songs Mr. Hargrave hadn't heard in years. And sometimes they would say nothing at all, letting the crackle of the fire and the hush of snow outside fill the spaces between them. One night, just after the new year had begun, Mira woke up to find the bed beside her empty. Elijah wasn't there. Elijah wasn't there to see us. She slipped on her robe and padded through the hallway, her feet quiet against the wood. She found him in the living room, sitting by the fire, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Softly, he looked up and nodded, just thinking. He nodded again. "I don't hate him," Elijah whispered. "Even now. Isn't that strange?" Mira shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Not strange. It's beautiful." He stared into the fire, watching the soft flames rise and curl. "I wonder what made him that way, so cold, so greedy." "Maybe," Mira said slowly, "he thought love had to be one, like a prize. Maybe he was afraid he wouldn't be enough." Otherwise, Elijah sighed, and in trying to win, he lost everything. They sat in silence a while longer. Then Mira rested her head on his shoulder. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything, promise me. We'll never let pain make us forget how to be kind." Elijah wrapped his arm around her. "Promise." Later that month, a letter arrived. It was from Eleanor. Not long, not emotional, just a few brief lines, written in her neat, distant handwriting. She had moved out of Caleb's former home, now seized by the authorities. She was staying with her sister, far from the city. There was no apology in the letter, but there was something close to regret. "Your father chose to stay with you," she wrote. "I understand. I'm not ready to face it all yet. But I hope. One day, maybe." Elijah folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beside old photographs and small keepsakes. He didn't feel anger, only a quiet sadness. For the love that had always been conditional, and the love that had never been tried, as winter melted into spring. The world seemed to breathe again. The snow gave way to buds of green. Birds returned. The air warmed. Laughter, once tentative, grew louder in their home. Myra began teaching at a nearby school, running story time for children. Her voice, always gentle, now carried the calm strength of someone who had survived heartbreak and chosen grace anyway. Elijah continued to rise in his firm, not with showy leaps, but with steady, respectful steps. And Mr. Hargrave, older now, slower, smiled more often. He took up journalling. Each evening, after dinner, he would write a few lines about the weather, about a memory, about how Myra served his favorite tea without being asked, about how Elijah reminded him so much of his own father, not in the way he looked, but in the way he listened. One afternoon, soft rain tapped on the windows. Mr. Hargrave closed his journal and looked out at the garden. The sunflowers were gone now, but new life was already rising. He turned to Elijah and said, "Thank you for giving me a second chance at the end of my story." Elijah smiled, his eyes glistening. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the best chapters come near the end." The candle flickered once more on the table. Warm, steady, soft spring gave way to the warmth of early summer, not the harsh, sweltering kind, but a gentle season, filled with golden mornings and evenings that smelled of jasmine and earth. The windows were often open now, letting in the breeze, the scent of baking bread, and the distant hum of life passing by in their modest little home. Peace no longer had to be fought for. It had taken root. Mr. Hargrave now moved more slowly, but more peacefully. He wore simple clothes, and each day began with a small ritual. He would water the garden with Elijah, sit with Myra over tea, write a few words in his journal by the window, his legs wrapped in a warm blanket no matter the weather. He had found a rhythm, the quiet kind most men never live long enough to discover. One morning, he sat in the living room holding a photo album. The old kind with yellowed pages and plastic sleeves that crinkled softly with each turn. "Do you remember this?" he asked Elijah, pointing to a faded picture. Elijah sat beside him. It was a photo from a school play. Elijah, only 10, stood in the back row, wearing a crooked paper crown, smiling nervously. Caleb was beside him, arms folded, already taller, and sharper in his eyes. "You forgot to come that day," Elijah said quietly. Not bitter, just truthful. Mr. Hargrave stared at the photo a long while. "I remember," he said. "I was stuck at work, and I told myself it didn't matter, that you'd understand." Elijah nodded. "I did understand. I just remembered anyway." There was a silence between them. Not awkward, just honest. Then Mr. Hargrave closed the album and looked at his son. "I spent so much time looking past you," he whispered, "trying to make Caleb into something he wasn't, hoping he'd carry the pride I thought I needed, but in doing so, I ignored the son who quietly carried the love I truly needed." Elijah looked away, blinking slowly. Myra entered then, holding a tray with honey cakes and tea. She placed it gently on the table. "I thought we could have a little celebration today," she smiled. "For what?" Mr. Hargrave asked. "For being here, together, for peace, and for second chances." They sat together that evening as the sky turned a rich, sleepy lavender. Soft wind moved through the curtains. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. A baby laughed, and in their home, the only sound was the clinking of cups and the quiet rustle of warm conversation. Myra spoke of the children at school. One boy who had just discovered a love for poetry, and a shy little girl who had finally read aloud in front of the class. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, and Mr. Hargrave listened with the quiet awe of someone who had spent too long ignoring such beauty. "You have a gift," he told her. She smiled, just patience and gentleness. "Things the world often forgets to value." He looked down, thoughtful, like you and Elijah. A few weeks later, Elijah received a letter in the mail. It bore an unfamiliar name, but the return address was from the town where Caleb had been transferred for his sentence. Mira brought it to him. I'm sure he opened it slowly. Sitting on the edge of the bed inside was a single page. The handwriting wasn't familiar at first, but as he read, it became unmistakably Caleb's, tighter, more rigid than before, but clear. Elijah, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this, but I wanted to say, I saw the paper your lawyer filed on my behalf. I know it was you. You didn't have to. I didn't deserve it. I've been sitting with everything I've done, and there's no way to undo it. But I think about the house, the laughter, Mom's old recipes, even you. Always in the corner, quiet, kind. Yeah. I used to think that made you weak. Now I know it made you strong. I'm sorry for the lies, for blaming you, for everything. I don't know what comes next. But I hope, if Dad's still alive. He knows I didn't hate him. I just didn't know how to be loved. Elijah read it twice. Then once more he didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just folded the letter neatly, placed it in his drawer beside his father's will, and closed it. Mira entered moments later. He looked up at her from Caleb. He said, Do you want to talk about it? No, he replied, softly. Not now. She nodded, then walked over and rested her hand on his shoulder. You don't have to carry it all tonight, she whispered, and he didn't. That night he slept deeply. For the first time in many, many years, later that month, Mr. Hargrave's health took a slow turn. Not sudden, not violent, just a steady retreat. He slept more, spoke less, but still smiled, still listened, and still watched the sunlight. On the garden with the reverence of someone who finally understood how rare and sacred that light truly was. One afternoon, as twilight approached and the world outside glowed with quiet gold, he asked Elijah to bring his journal. Elijah sat beside his father's bed, as Mira placed a cool cloth on his forehead. I want to leave something, Mr. Hargrave said. Elijah opened the journal. Write this, the old man whispered. *2. My children. I did not always know what love looked like, but I know what regret feels like. Let the truth be this. Love does not raise its voice. It does not demand recognition it gives. It waits. And when returned, it heals generations. Elijah finished writing. Tears quietly running down his cheek. Mr. Hargrave smiled. Keep the journal. One day, maybe your child will read it. Elijah looked up. Maybe. The room was so still then, just the sound of Myra lighting a lavender candle, just the soft rhythm of a heart. It's growing tired but full, and outside the breeze whispered. Through the sunflowers once again, the final night came quietly. There were no thunderclaps, no storm, no dramatic cry, only stillness. Mr. Hargrave lay in his bed near the garden window, the covers pulled gently to his chest, his breathing shallow, but calm. The lavender candle flickered beside him, casting soft golden circles across the walls. It was the same candle Myra lit each evening. The scent filled the room like memory, warm and slow. Elijah sat beside the bed, holding his father's hand. Now thin and veined but still warm, Mira stood at the doorway, silent, her arms folded loosely, watching with eyes full of love and goodbye. Outside, the moon hung low, round, quiet, and kind. The breeze carried the faint rustle of the sunflowers, though most had bent now, bowing gently under their own weight. Mr. Hargrave opened his eyes for the last time that night. He looked at his son. You were the home I never knew I needed, he whispered. Elijah leaned closer, his voice catching in his throat. And you tried. In the end, you really tried. The old man's lips curved upward, just slightly. Then one last breath, soft as silk. And then stillness, not cold, not cruel, just complete. The morning after, the house was wrapped in a hush. Even the birds respected. No music played, no words were said for a long time. Elijah stood in the garden barefoot, the dew cooling his feet. He looked up at the sky, painted pale blue and gold by the early sun, and for the first time in years, he let the tears fall freely. Not from grief alone, but from a kind of release. A lifetime of waiting, hoping, hurting, all letting go in one slow, sacred moment. Myra came behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her cheek between his shoulder blades. He left in peace, she said softly. Elijah nodded. Double quotes, because of you. He whispered, the funeral was small, no grand eulogies, no speeches, just those who had truly known him. As he had become, Elijah read a passage from the journal. Mira placed a sunflower by the gravestone, bright and full of life. And as the final handful of earth fell upon the coffin, a wind passed gently through the trees, lifting dry leaves into the air like quiet blessings after the burial. They didn't return to an empty house. They returned to his house, their house. Now quiet, yes, but never cold. That night, Elijah lit the fireplace. Mira brought tea, and they sat together in the warmth, listening to the wood crackle, the wind whisper, and the silence. Healing. Weeks passed, then months. Elijah went back to work, more focused now, more grounded. His colleagues noticed a deeper calm in him. Not heavy, not distant, but strong. Like a man who had walked through fire barefoot, come out with soft eyes instead of scars. Mira, too, began something new. She started writing a book, a collection of stories, soft and emotional, not about war or heroes or grandeur, but about the quiet strength of ordinary people.
Ow!
About love that asks for nothing. About families that break and learn to build again. She dedicated the first story to Mr. Hargrave, to the man who learned to love late but fully. Elijah framed a copy of that page and placed it on the mantel. One day, a letter arrived from Eleanor. It was longer this time, still neat, still restrained, but there was something different in the ink, something softer. Elijah, I heard about your father. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I thought. It might not matter if I came, but I was wrong. I've had time to think. And time has a way of making pride seem foolish. I miss the garden. I miss the sound of Mira's soft footsteps. I miss you, if you're willing. I would like to visit. I won't ask for more than that, just a visit. Love, Mom. Elijah read it twice, then showed it to Myra. Myra's expression didn't shift. She just said, your heart knows the answer. 2 weeks later, Eleanor arrived. She stepped out of the car slowly, older now, once perfect posture softened by time and loss. She wore her hair pulled back neatly and in her hands. She clutched a small bouquet of fresh jasmine. Mira met her at the gate. She didn't smile too brightly. She didn't pretend nothing had happened, but she opened the gate, and that was enough. Eleanor stepped into the house quietly. Her eyes scanned the room, resting for a long time on the photo of Mr. Hargrave on the mantel, framed in wood, a small sunflower pinned beneath. I read about him, she said softly. He meant changed. Elijah nodded. So did you? She said, looking at him. You built a home? He didn't speak. Instead, he walked over to her, held her hand, and guided her to the table, where Mira had already placed warm tea, lemon biscuits, and a small vase of jasmine. They sat. The clock ticked gently in the background, and for the first time in years, mother and son looked into each other's eyes without expectation. Just presence, just truth. That evening, after Eleanor left, promising to return soon, and this time to help in the garden, Elijah and Mira sat beneath the stars. The night was clear, the air was soft, and the past, for the first time, didn't ache. I used to think peace came when everything was resolved, Elijah said, watching the moon. And now, Myra asked, resting her head on his shoulder, now I know. Peace comes when we stop needing everything to be perfect. Myra nodded. It comes when we choose what to carry, she whispered. They sat in silence, then hand in hand, heart to heart, and though their journey was far from over, the hardest part was behind them. The candlelight inside the house flickered. Softly in the window, a warm, steady glow. A reminder of all they had endured, all they had forgiven, and all the love still waiting to bloom. As summer lingered into late July, the house became something more than shelter. It became a rhythm. It became home. Each morning, the curtains swayed with the breeze. The birds returned to the feeder Elijah had built himself, piece by piece, with rough wood and careful hands. Myra planted herbs just outside the kitchen window, rosemary, mint, thyme, and their scent would rise up each morning, mixing with the aroma of toasted bread and cinnamon tea. Sometimes, Elijah would wake before dawn, step barefoot into the garden, and just stand there, breathing, feeling, listening. He didn't think of the past as much anymore. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he had grown larger than the pain. One afternoon, Mira brought out an old box filled with letters. Letters from her childhood. Old postcards from cousins, even folded notes she'd once written to herself when she was a teenager. Messages full of hope. Dreams. I used to believe I'd live in a big city, she laughed softly. Somewhere loud, fast, with neon lights and cafes on every corner. And now, Elijah asked. She looked around at the quiet. The wind. The wildflowers growing along the fence. I think I found something better, she said. Something real, he nodded, resting his hand over hers. Sometimes we think we're chasing greatness, he murmured. But what we need is gentleness. A week later, Eleanor visited again. This time she brought a small pie she had baked herself, blueberry, with a slightly uneven crust. I didn't know if it would turn out, she admitted, placing it carefully on the table, but I thought it was worth trying. They shared the pie together in the late afternoon sun, and Myra brewed vanilla tea to go with it. Eleanor sat straighter than before, not with pride, but with purpose. She no longer spoke over others. She no longer needed to fill the space. She simply listened, watched, learned. After tea, she wandered out to the garden, gently touching the petals of each sunflower, pausing to smell the rosemary. Elijah stood beside her after a while, both of them looking out at the stillness. I never imagined things would end up like this, Eleanor said. Elijah glanced at her. You mean us being here? Peaceful? No, she replied. I mean me, being grateful for a life I once looked down on. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only truth. You had to lose something, Elijah said gently. To see. What mattered? Eleanor nodded. I thought wealth made a family. Turns out, it was kindness all along. Later that night, Mira lit a candle on the WINDOWSILL. It had become a tradition now, one candle. Every night, no matter what, for the people we've lost, she would say, and the people we've become, Elijah would add. And some nights, they'd sit in that candlelight with no words at all, letting silence do the talking, letting their hands find each other again and again. It's like rivers flowing back to sea. One afternoon, as autumn returned with golden skies and wind-swept leaves, Elijah received a call from the city office. The land that once held their childhood, home now under review due to Caleb's fraud case, had been cleared of debt. The court had ruled in favor of the Hargrave name. If you wish, the clerk said, you can reclaim it, rebuild, or sell to you. Elijah stood there, holding the phone to his ear, listening to the words like they were coming from a dream. After he hung up, he walked out to the garden, found Mira kneeling beside the rosemary, and told her everything. She looked up at him, brows raised. You could have it back. Yes, he nodded. We could. She smiled softly, and do you want to, Elijah? Knelt beside her. I don't know, he said honestly. That house, it held so much of our past, so much pain, but also laughter. It was never just one thing. Maybe, Mira said, brushing her fingers through the soil, you don't have to go back to the house. Maybe you just plant something new on the same ground. Elijah looked down at her hands, covered in earth, rooted in the present. I'll think about it. He whispered, and he did, for many days. A month later, They visited the plot. The original house was gone now, bulldozed during the investigation. Only a wide stretch of land remained, quiet and overgrown with wild grass and wind-blown leaves. Eleanor came too. She stood near the edge, clutching her coat against the breeze. "This place feels smaller than I remember," she said. Elijah walked out onto the land. He crouched and touched the soil. "It feels quieter." Mira knelt beside him, pressing her palm to the ground. "We could build something simple," she said. "Not a mansion, not a showpiece, just a place for love." Eleanor, still standing nearby, closed her eyes. "I used to think our legacy was in our wealth," she said. "But maybe it's in what we leave behind in people, in what we repair." And for the first time, she stepped out into the field too, standing beside her son and daughter-in-law, in the place where so much had once been lost, not to mourn, but to imagine, in the weeks that followed. Elijah filed the papers to reclaim the land. He hired a modest team, a builder who specialized in cozy homes, a designer who believed in natural light and open air. Mira chose the tiles. Eleanor picked the garden stones. And Elijah chose the front door color, soft blue, just like the door on their first rented home. They didn't rush the construction. It wasn't about speed. It was about presence. And when it was done, a small house with wide windows, sunlit kitchen, and a garden that stretched far and gentle, they stood before it one golden afternoon. "This," Elijah said, "isn't just a house." Mira smiled. "It's the story rewritten. It was not perfect, not grand, but honest and full of love. The kind of place where new memories could grow, right over the wounds of the old." The new house wasn't extravagant. It didn't sparkle with chandeliers or echo with marbled halls, but it breathed. Windows opened to golden fields in the hush of wind through trees. Wooden floors held the warmth of sunlight, and the walls, painted soft earth tones, felt like they'd always belonged there, even though they were brand new. At the center of it all was the garden. Mira designed it herself. It wasn't the same as their first little patch of earth. It was bigger now, more open, but still gentle. The flowers weren't planted in straight, controlled rows. Instead, they followed the curves of the land, wild and free, like forgiveness, blooming where resentment once grew. At the back of the garden, near the stone path that Eleanor had laid herself, stood a tree, a sapling at first. But it had been planted with care, with reverence, a weeping willow, its long, delicate branches bent low in the breeze, like arms reaching down to cradle the earth. "We'll name it after him," Elijah had said softly. "For your father, for the part of him that changed, the part that stayed." Mira had nodded, watering the roots gently. That autumn, the family gathered for a quiet celebration. It had been 1 full year since Mr. Hargrave had passed. Not a day went by when Elijah didn't think of him in the quiet moment after breakfast. In the way the chair near the fireplace remained slightly pushed back, as if still waiting for someone to sit. But this time, the memories didn't ache. They warmed. Eleanor brought an old photo album worn at the edges. "He always kept this in the drawer," she said, gently placing it on the table. "I thought it belonged here now." Mira prepared a meal filled with Mr. Hargrave's favorite things: roasted vegetables with thyme, warm barley soup, and small, honey-dipped biscuits. They sat on the porch as the sun lowered, casting gold across the house, the garden, and the little willow tree swaying gently at the edge of it all. "We've come far," Eleanor said, breaking a long silence. "Yes," Mira replied, "and we came slow. It's how it lasts," Elijah added. No one needed to say more. The air spoke for them, peaceful, deep, and filled with things that didn't need names. As the seasons shifted again, life found new rhythms. Elijah was offered a position at a nonprofit, one that helped families find affordable housing after financial loss. It didn't pay as much as his old firm, but it felt right. He said yes without hesitation. "I want to help people rebuild," he told Mira. "Not just houses, but dignity." Mira began hosting weekly story nights at the local library. The children loved her voice, slow, steady, and soft like wind through curtains. Parents often stayed just to listen to, their shoulders dropping as if someone had turned down the noise of the world. Elijah would sometimes sneak in quietly and sit at the back, just to watch her, not because he didn't know the stories, but because the way she told them made him remember how healing sounded. One Sunday morning, Mira held Elijah's hand and placed it gently on her belly. He blinked, unsure at first, then he felt it, the smallest flutter, like wings, like a whisper, like hope. His eyes filled instantly. "You're sure?" he breathed. Mira nodded. "Elijah, we're going to have a child." Right. He closed his eyes and let the moment flood in, not with panic, but with awe and peace and a kind of joy he hadn't felt since childhood, the kind that comes when the world feels gentle again. The months that followed were full of anticipation, not rushed, but mindful. Eleanor, now staying with them most weekends, helped fold little clothes and paint the nursery in a soft blue-gray. She insisted on sewing tiny blankets even though her stitches weren't as straight as they used to be. "I miss this," she said once, holding a little sweater close to her heart. "When you two were small, I let the important moments slip past." "You're here now," Elijah told her. "That's what matters." And she believed him. One evening, long before the baby arrived, Elijah stood beneath the willow tree. The branches danced lightly in the wind, and the stars had just begun to show in the sky. He thought of his father, of the house they lost, of the home they found, of Caleb, who still sent letters from time to time. Short, reflective, sometimes remorseful, sometimes silent, and he thought, of the child, his child. "What kind of father will I be?" he whispered into the dark. From behind, Mira's hand slipped into his. "The kind who listens," she said. "The kind who loves without condition. The kind you always wished for." He turned and kissed her forehead, and under the willow tree, surrounded by all they had planted, all they had lost, and all they had found again, they stood in silence. Together, a few days later, Elijah found something in Mr. Hargrave's old journal he hadn't noticed before, a page tucked between two others. Written in shakier handwriting than the rest, asterisk, "If I could go back, I'd teach them differently. I'd teach them that success is not the applause of strangers, but the laughter of a home where everyone feels safe. Asterisk, I'd teach them that the child who stays behind to hold your hand is not weak but wise. Asterisk, I'd teach them that the greatest wealth a man can hold is the peace he leaves behind when he's gone." Asterisk. Elijah read it slowly, loud. Mira listened from the doorway, and in that small moment, the past and present curled around them like soft wind through willow leaves. A family once broken, a whole, not because it had never fractured, but because love had grown back stronger. Through every crack, winter came once more, but it did not come with the same weight it used to carry. This time, it came soft. The cold was gentle, hushed by blankets, thick socks, and the golden glow of firelight. The new house stood steady, against the wind, built not only with wood and nails, but with patience, forgiveness, and care. Inside, a rocking chair had been placed near the window. It faced the garden, and in the corner of the nursery, there stood a white cradle, hand-carved, by Elijah himself. It had taken him weeks of quiet effort. Mira would often find him bent over the wood, smoothing each curve as if it were a prayer. "I want it to be perfect," he'd said, eyes focused. "Hands coated in sawdust." "It already is," she replied. Touching his shoulder, the cradle was simple, like everything else in their life now. But it was full of love. Every grain, every joint, every stroke of paint. A vessel not just for sleep, but for safety, for beginnings. One snow-filled morning, Eleanor brought a box from her attic, an old, weathered trunk that smelled of cedar and memory. "These were yours," she said to Elijah as she unlatched the lid. "Blankets, tiny clothes, your first shoes." Myra leaned in, marveling at the tiny socks and soft wool caps. Everything felt stitched with another time, and yet familiar. "You kept these?" Elijah asked, surprised. Eleanor looked at him, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. I wasn't always the mother you needed, but I couldn't throw away the proof that I once held you close. There was no anger in Elijah's heart, anymore, just quiet understanding. He touched the fabric soft as breath, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the story of his life didn't start with pain. It started with being loved. Even if imperfectly, the baby was due in March. Mira moved more slowly now, one hand always on her growing belly. She would hum to the child, sing lullabies from her childhood, and read aloud from storybooks, even when she was alone. It's never too early, she'd say, to let someone know they're wanted. Elijah. Painted stars on the nursery ceiling. Not bright ones, but faint and glimmering, like the real sky on a quiet night. He added a soft night lamp shaped like a moon, and a handmade mobile of tiny clouds and silver birds that danced gently in the breeze from the window. We're ready, he whispered one evening as he sat beside Mira, his hand resting on her stomach. The baby kicked gently in reply. They both laughed, tired, excited, afraid, and overjoyed, all at once. Then one night, as the wind wrapped itself around the corners of the house and frost painted the window glass, Mira touched Elijah's arm and said, "It's time." He didn't panic. He just held her hand, wrapped her in her coat, and whispered, "We're okay. We're going to be okay." They drove through the snow, slow, careful, calm. Each breath between them felt sacred. The car heater hummed quietly. The road was empty and still. And when they reached the hospital, Elijah helped her inside and didn't let go. Not once. The hours passed slowly, like a gentle tide coming in. Not rushed. Not forced, just inevitable. Mira's voice trembled through the pain. Elijah's hand never left hers. And then, like a breath, like a dawn, a cry filled the room. Sharp, bright, alive. A girl, small and pink and loud, already fierce in her voice. Elijah stared at her like he'd never seen anything more extraordinary. Mira, exhausted and glowing, reached for the baby. "Hello," she whispered as tears fell down her cheeks. "Welcome home." They named her Laura. It meant light, because she had come not to replace the past, but to illuminate it, to heal it with her very being. At home, the cradle was ready. So was the room. So were the arms that had waited for years, decades even, to hold something this soft. This new dot. Eleanor wept the first time she held her. "She looks like you," she told Mira, but Elijah saw something else too in her. Tiny fingers, in her steady gaze, in the way she gripped his thumb with surprising strength. "She carries us," he whispered one night, watching her sleep. "She carries the whole story." The house felt fuller now, not just with sound, but with meaning. The cries at night didn't frustrate Elijah. They moved him. Reminded him that life was here, demanding, tender, real. Mira took to motherhood like moonlight takes to the ocean, calm, graceful, deep. They were tired, but they were never alone in that. Tiredness, every look exchanged across the kitchen, every quiet sigh, every shared cup of tea in the early hours before dawn. It all wove them tighter together. One day Elijah sat with Leora in the garden, cradling her in his arms beneath the willow tree. The branches swayed above them, whispering secrets to the sky. "I'll tell you everything one day," he said softly. "Not all at once, not to burden you, but to teach you what love can survive." Leora blinked up at him, calm, curious. He kissed her forehead. "And I'll tell you who your grandfather became, not just who he once was. I'll tell you how your grandmother found her voice again, and how your mother taught me what gentleness looks like." He looked out across the garden where sunflowers now bloomed again. "You come from pain," he whispered. "You come from healing too. And that is something sacred." A wind moved through the garden then, lifting the petals, brushing the trees, rustling the leaves, like an answer, like a blessing. As the days passed, peace became something they could touch. Not just wish for. Leora grew quickly. Her laugh filled the halls. Her tiny footsteps echoed like joy through every room. She would wobble into the kitchen, arms outstretched. Mira would catch her every time, as if love had arms that never got tired. Eleanor sat with her each morning, brushing her hair, with soft fingers telling her stories of Elijah's childhood, the good ones, the ones full of wonder and scraped knees and firefly jars. She's bringing it all back, Lena said one day, smiling at Mira, the light, the laughter, the softness we forgot to make room for. And she was right. Leora wasn't just a child. She was healing in motion. But life, even when beautiful, continues forward, and with it come chapters we don't always ask for. One late summer evening, Elijah received a call from an unfamiliar number. He answered gently, his voice low. The woman on the other end spoke quietly. "Your brother? He's not well." Elijah stood still by the window, the sunset bleeding gold through the glass. "Is he? He's in the hospital. Liver damage. The kind that doesn't always come back." Elijah didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said softly, "Thank you for letting me know." Mira watched him from the hallway, sensing the shift in his breath. When he turned, his eyes held the weight of many years. "Caleb," he said simply. Mira didn't ask what he would do. She already knew, because some parts of Elijah had never changed, the parts that held on to kindness, even when no one returned it, that weekend. Elijah visited the hospital. Caleb looked thin, pale, like a man who had lost not just his health, but his fire. "You came," he croaked. Elijah nodded and pulled a chair close. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," Caleb whispered. "I didn't come for answers," Elijah said, "or apologies. I just came." Caleb looked away, ashamed. "I ruined everything." Elijah was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You broke a lot, but not everything." Caleb's eyes filled. "I don't know how to say sorry anymore." "You don't have to say it," Elijah whispered. "Just mean it. Just rest now." Over the next few weeks, Elijah visited often. He brought books, music, even a recording of Leora's laughter on his phone. "She sounds like Mom," Caleb said once, eyes closed, listening. Eleanor came too, just once. She didn't say much. She sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed a small photo of the old house on the table. "We were a family once," she whispered, and Caleb nodded, eyes wet. "I remember." Caleb passed one quiet morning in early autumn. No drama, no anger, just stillness. Elijah held his hand through the final hour, not because he had to, but because somewhere beneath the betrayal, the silence, the distance, there was still a thread that once tied two boys to a shared roof, a shared table, a shared mother's voice. That thread had frayed, but it had never fully broken, and Elijah honored it. The funeral was small. There were no speeches. Only a few quiet prayers, and a soft breeze passing through the trees. Elijah placed a single sunflower beside the headstone. "We were different," he whispered, "but we were brothers." Then he walked away, not bitter, not burdened, but free, back at home. Leora greeted him with laughter. She threw her arms around his legs and looked up, his eyes bright as stars. Mira met him at the door, her hands warm, her gaze steady. "You okay?" Asked, he nodded slowly. "I am now." They stood together in the quiet of the evening, listening to the distant wind, the creak of the willow tree, the whisper of peace settling in once again. That night, Elijah opened Mr. Hargrave's journal one last time. He added a final note. Asterisk forgiveness. Is not forgetting, it's remembering without pain. It's choosing peace when the world offered you poison. And it's knowing that love, the real kind, doesn't need to be loud. To last asterisk, he closed the book and placed it on the shelf above, Leora's cradle, where it would stay, for her, for the future. The seasons passed gently after Caleb's death. Time didn't rush now. It moved like mist in the morning, slow and quiet. Slipping through the spaces between memories and moments, Elijah continued his work, helping others rebuild what they had lost. Sometimes it was homes. Sometimes it was dignity. He understood the quiet ache of starting over, not from books or training, but from living it. Myra's stories, once read aloud in a small room at the library, became a published collection. Homes that hold us, they called it. The first dedication read, "To the quiet hearts who stay kind." Even when they are forgotten, it touched lives far beyond their little town, and Leora grew like sunlight. She had Mira's eyes full of softness and wonder, and Elijah's quiet strength. She spoke early, asked questions too big for her age, and often sat beneath the willow tree in silence, as though she were listening to something older than herself. One evening she asked, "Papa, why do grown-ups cry when they remember?" Elijah smiled. "Because some memories are so full," he said, "they spill over." Eleanor aged with grace. She no longer tried to fix things with control. Instead, she learned to love without needing to lead. She became Leora's Nana L, and every Friday they baked together butter, cookies shaped like stars and hearts, their kitchen echoing with soft giggles and flour in the air. One day, Eleanor sat with Elijah in the garden, holding a warm mug between her hands. "I used to want more than this," she said. "Bigger life, grand rooms, fancy names." "Now?" Elijah asked. She looked around at the willow tree, the quiet home, the birds flitting past the fence. "Now I realize. This was the big life. I just couldn't see it before." They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't need. 2 years passed like petals falling. Leora turned 6, then 9. She read the journal Elijah had once tucked away. Not all at once. Just a few pages at a time, beside the fire, her fingers trailing the words like they were sacred. "Grandpa was brave," she said once. "He learned to be," Elijah replied, "and that counts." On her 10th birthday, she asked for just one thing, a sunflower patch. So they planted one together, Elijah, Mira, Eleanor, and Leora, side by side in the earth, hands messy, hearts clean. That summer, the patch bloomed higher than their fence, and Leora danced between them, arms wide, hair wild, her laughter lifting into the sky like prayer. Elijah sometimes sat at the edge of the garden in the early hours, watching the sunrise, a blanket around his shoulders, a warm cup in his hands. He wasn't old yet, but he had become steady still. A man no longer running from anything sometimes. He'd think of Caleb, not with anger, but with a soft ache like an old bruise you touch gently. Just to remember it once hurt. Other times he thought of his father. He'd remember the man in the last year of his life, the one who finally saw Elijah, truly saw him, and said so. That version of Mr. Hargrave had died with peace in his eyes, and that, Elijah knew, was a gift not every man received. One autumn, Eleanor passed in her sleep. Quiet, peaceful, she had gone to bed early, kissed Leora's forehead and whispered, "You'll grow into something beautiful." That night, she didn't wake again. They buried her beside Mr. Hargrave, not out of obligation, but because despite everything, she had loved him. And he had loved her. Even through their mistakes, their silence, their favoritism, there had been love, imperfect. Yes, but real. Mira placed a sunflower on the grave. Leora whispered a poem she'd written. Sometimes the heart forgets its way, but love remembers. After the funeral, Elijah sat with Leora beneath the willow tree. She leaned into him, quiet. Nana L was soft, she said. "She learned how to be," Elijah replied. Leora looked up. "Did you forgive her?" "I did," he said, brushing her hair from her face, "because she forgave herself first. That's when forgiveness lasts." Leora didn't fully understand, but she would. One day, years continued to drift like pages. Leora became a teenager and a young woman, thoughtful, steady, full of questions and wonder. She studied art and storytelling. She believed in gentleness. She believed in beginnings. One evening, she sat with Elijah, now older, grayer, but still full of quiet strength. "Papa," she asked, "why didn't you turn bitter?" After everything, Elijah looked at the stars. "I almost did," he said. "But then I met your mother. She loved me so quietly. I couldn't hold on to my anger. It just didn't belong in the home we were building. He smiled. And then we had you. The willow tree grew taller. Tree grew taller. Its branches reached far, and its leaves whispered in the wind like memory. On its bark, Leora carved the initials of her family not because they were perfect, but because they were hers. In the garden, the sunflowers bloomed year after year. Even after Elijah passed quietly one spring morning, Myra found a single one leaning toward the porch as though it knew he was gone. But not really. Myra, now older, tended the garden still, her hands slower, her voice softer, but her love just as deep. Leora turned the house into a place for others, retreat, a storytelling school, a garden of healing, a space where broken hearts came to remember how to bloom. On the front door, still painted soft blue, she hung a wooden sign. This is not a perfect home. It is a loving one. Inside, she kept the journal on a small shelf by the hearth. People came, read the story, wept, laughed, felt seen, and when they asked her, "Is it true?" she would smile gently. "It was once my father's life," she'd say, "and now it's my beginning." In the end, the house that was sold in Betrayal was replaced by one built in love. The parents who favored wealth learned to value kindness too late, but not too late to be redeemed. The son, who was quiet, became the anchor of healing, the root that held firm, and the legacy. Not money, not names, but love passed down like seeds, scattered in honest hands. That grew into a life even the storms could not steal. Moral of the story: treat all your children equally. Love is not measured in income or status. The wealth of character will always outlast the wealth of gold. And sometimes, the quiet one, the overlooked one, is the one who saves the family in the end. The end.